Hey, it's Pastor Dudley Rutherford here, and I'm so excited. Many of you know I'm the senior pastor of Shepherd Church in Porter Ranch, California, clear out there on the West Coast, and been out here for a long, long time, and just excited because for so long we've talked about doing a podcast, and this is actually episode number 1. And so thank you for tuning in, and we hope that you're a part of this endeavor as we seek to truly make a difference in people's lives. This podcast is called Godly Goosebumps. A couple things behind that name. Number one, obviously we wanted to have a name that people would remember. There are so many podcasts today, it's difficult to stand out and to garner a following. And so that name, we think, is a name that you just hear it one time and you'll remember it, or if you'll see it, it's something that will help you to remember to continue to go back to that podcast. But the main thought behind that name, Godly Goosebumps, goes to the meaning and the purpose of this podcast. And again, there are so many different podcasts that cover so many different topics, but the one topic that we want to discuss week after week is the thought or the idea of telling stories that only God can orchestrate. In other words, each and every day we have these moments where you hear a story or you tell a story or you might read something in a book or hear something on the news or maybe from a friend or a loved one. And stories are stories, but there are some stories that are different than others in that some seem miraculous in nature, some seem divine, some seem like this is not possible. And what we want to do with these stories is we want to articulate true stories, things that truly happened, that as you dive in and you start to piece through the details of that story, you realize that this is something only God could come up with. You know, I even think like going back to the very beginning, the story of creation, I don't know if you can just make that up out of nothing, that story of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And so the idea is that as we tell these stories, I think, first of all, they're always thrilling, and you, as a Christian or as a believer, if you're a person of faith and you're tuning in, it just reaffirms your faith. But if you're a skeptic, if you're someone who doubts, if you're a non-believer, if you're not a church-going person, if you don't believe that there's a God, you might be agnostic, maybe even an atheist. Our hope is, as together, I tell the stories that I have, and I'm going to ask that you call in or write in and submit your stories. We'll have a website called godlygoosebumps.com, but as you share our stories, and we'll share those on the podcast, that those who listen, as they hear the intricate details of these stories, that they draw this conclusion that there must be a God, because this story isn't possible without God. And these stories, when you hear them, they cause goosebumps, or there's another phrase, the hair on the back of my head or the back of my neck stands, or something like that. Just something that's so thrilling and so moving, so emotional, that you're just reminded of the sovereignty of God. And so these stories, and we're going to be telling one after another, I pray that they bring hope to people. So first thing, we want you to subscribe, so make sure you hit the subscribe button. You can find this podcast on any platform where you're finding your podcast. And also, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. So some people just like to listen, some people like to watch. But the more you subscribe, or the more often you can get this out on your platforms, I think we can build a great network. And of course, we'll hear many, many stories that bring us hope. I want to start off with just one small illustration, and this might freak some of you out, and this will be a politically incorrect podcast as well. I just want to do and say what God has put on my heart. We're not trying to offend anybody. We don't want to offend people, but So you might hear things that you might not agree with, but I hope that you'll stick with us and learn to enjoy these stories. And again, if you ever hear a story, make sure you send that in to us, and we'll put that on the podcast. But I found this story about some graduate students who did an experiment, and it's really kind of strange. They took these rats, and they put them on these cages where the rats had to spin the cage. And I think they turned the wheel sideways, is what I think took place, so that the rat, if it didn't keep the wheel spinning, they would fall into water and they would literally drown. And so what they did was they put these rats in this experiment in a dark cage where there was no light of any kind. And they put those rats on that wheel, and they started to spin, and they spun and they spun and they spun, and they had to keep going or they would fall into the water and die. And they spun for 6 hours was the average amount of time before they fell to their death, so to speak. So then they did the exact same experiment, but this time they put light. They put light in the cage. And as they went around the wheel, they were able to go for 17 hours. And what made the difference between the 6 hours and the 17 hours was that they could see, that they had hope. And I believe that's true with many, many people in our world today, because most people are going through some type of trial. They hurt on the inside. They don't know where to turn to. They are hopeless. And I mean that literally. They are hopeless. They're about to drown. They're about to die. And one of the main reasons is they don't have hope. They don't have hope. And it's my prayer through this podcast, as you hear these stories that are unbelievable in nature, but as you think through the intricacies of the story, you realize that only God could orchestrate these events. And when you know that there's a God, and when you know He can do miracles, and you know He can move mountains, and you know that He can do things that no man can do, as a mere mortal, it gives you hope. And that's what we want to do with these stories. We want to encourage, we want to inspire, we want to enlighten, we want to point people to the truth of God, the one true God, and tell stories, again, that give Him glory and give Him honor and give people hope. So again, this is Dudley Rutherford. This is our very first kind of opening introduction to Godly Goosebumps. You can follow us, learn more information at godlygoosebumps.com. Be sure to give us a follow and a share on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Wherever you listen to podcasts, we'll be there. And you can go to that website and send in your stories. Send in those stories. We'll look at them. We'll read through them. And if we feel like your story will be a blessing, we will certainly put it on air. So thank you for tuning in. God bless you. I'll be in touch. This is episode number 1 of Godly Goosebumps.